Hello and welcome to the Political Opinions podcast, where every opinion is given equal footing and political tolerance and debate are given their proper attention in a world where both are on the decline. Today's episode will cover different opinions on armed police. Police shootings have never had more attention than they do today, and many in society find themselves increasingly questioning whether or not police should be armed. Despite the pushback, however, there are those who maintain that armed police are better for society. Today, we will unpick and compare these opinions. Firstly, for those supporting armed police, we have this view that having armed police can help curb violent crime. Armed police can respond to any crime and be adequately prepared to deal with it. If, however, police didn't carry guns, then they would not be able to respond as quickly to, for example, crimes involving firearms. They would need specialised units, not just general police officers, to respond. Secondly, just as armed police can stop crime more effectively, so too can they deter it. If a criminal knows they will have to face armed police instead of just, for example, a taser, then it is likely that they may see the increased risk involved in their crime, and that may deter them from committing it to begin with. Secondly, beyond just stopping crime, if the police are dealing with criminals who have a gun and they are unarmed, then the policeman is at a disadvantage. They cannot shoot back, they are more vulnerable to criminals, and they cannot respond as effectively. Guns allow police both to subdue attackers through threats of using their firearms, as well as responding with live fire when they are threatened. This gives the police a critical line of defence to protect themselves as well as the public. Guns are also more effective at dealing with terrorists than a lack of guns. Being able to shoot a suicide bomber in the head from range is essential, for example, to stopping that suicide bomber getting too close and killing people. If the police cannot use guns, it is argued, therefore, they are more susceptible to dealing with terrorist attacks ineffectively. Another critical argument is that the world today is far more dangerous than it was, say, even 10 years ago. There is increasingly high rates of crime, and in places like the US, increasingly high rates of gun crime. And as such, police need to be able to deal with these criminals in the way that they can best do so, which to some is using guns. With more armed criminals, you therefore need more armed police. Finally, some argue that guns are essential because they are the only way to deal with armed crime. Knives can be stopped through tasers, for example, and someone using their fists can be stopped by being tackled to the ground. But a gun cannot be stopped except with another gun. Moving on now to those opposed to armed police. On this question of perception and safety, some say that an increased use of armed police could worsen violent crime. Police with guns are more likely to be distrusted by communities, meaning they may hide crimes and not report them for fears of causing a shootout. Furthermore, armed police may be perceived as more of a threat to criminals, and that may therefore escalate the situation on the basis that you are less likely to negotiate with people who are all pointing guns at you. Furthermore, some also argue that not having guns makes a police force more reputable and more trustworthy. It means that they are viewed as civilians and are not differentiated to such an extent as, say, the army might be. There's also a fear that criminals may actually start carrying guns themselves. If all the police have guns, then criminals may see the only way to actually deal with this is to carry their own guns. Be it bank robbers or members of organised crimes, sometimes the only way to respond to a threat is to deal with it in the same way, and as such, some people fear that criminals may increasingly carry firearms of their own. Armed officers would also be extremely expensive. Armed officers have to acquire more gear, mainly the guns they are carrying, but also they need more training, they need shooting ranges to practice, they need instructors, they need modified vehicles and police stations to house the guns, and so on. And therefore some argue that this increased cost is not worth it given the negative impacts I have and will continue to describe. Some also claim that armed police won't actually impact things such as terrorism. France and Germany have openly armed police, and yet they too, just as Britain, have suffered terrorist attacks. In fact, often their attacks have been worse. Armed police cannot stop an attack from ever happening, they can just deal with it in a more effective way. And as such, some argue you don't need to have all the police being armed, on the basis that that again won't help stop the attacks before it begins. And finally, armed police may be more prone to shooting as a first response than trying to negotiate and potentially arrest the perpetrators. Some claim that guns increase the risk of trigger-happy police, and there are a few repercussions from this. Firstly, there is an increased risk of innocent people being shot and killed, which is something no one really wants. Secondly, this in turn would harm trust in the police. It would make people scared of them and would impact effects such as the one I mentioned earlier of not trusting the police. Lastly, on this point, some claim that if we kill criminals, we will never truly understand their motives. This means we will have a reduced ability to prevent similar actions from occurring in the future. Finally, some argue that guns miss the point of armed crime. For example, in America, you have armed police responding to armed civilians. However, some claim this is not necessary, and instead what should be done is addressing what they view as the core issue, the fact that guns are so legal. If there are very few guns, it means not all police need to be armed. Moving on now to the comparison. Firstly, on the question of, do armed police actually stop crime? Well, those saying yes argue both that it allows police to respond more effectively to essentially any crime that is being committed, because a gun will always have a use, and furthermore, it can deter crime from happening to begin with, due to the increased risk in facing armed police. Those disagreeing, however, argue that it may push criminals to carry guns too, to respond to the armed police, and may simply lead to dead criminals after the crime is committed. It doesn't actually address the core issues, but rather is a superficial response. Then, on the question of how effectively does it deal with terrorism? Those saying armed police are good argue that guns are the most effective way to deal with terrorists. They can respond better than, for example, police without guns. If you have armed terrorists roaming around, police who aren't armed, which could be the majority in, for example, somewhere like the UK, would not be able to respond effectively. However, those disagreeing argue, firstly, that guns can't stop an unknown attack from happening. A bomb going off will not be stopped from a policeman 10 minutes away being armed. And they would point to the fact that in Europe and America, despite the fact that there are armed police, terrorist attacks still happen far too regularly. Then, on this issue of trust, some claim that police are not viewed with enough respect. Some even go so far as to claim that guns will give police more respect. And then on the flip side of this, some say that police don't even need to be respected. Their job is to be able to stop a crime, and if that comes with harming their trust, it's a worthy trade-off. However, those disagreeing argue, firstly, that armed police harms the trust in that police force. It destroys this image of a civilian protection force, which was one of the main motivations behind creating police forces, not using armed forces to begin with. On the question of whether shooting criminals is good or bad, those supporting armed police argue that killing a dangerous criminal is an effective way to deal with them. They cannot risk lives from this dangerous criminal just to arrest them. However, those on the other side would disagree. They say that killing criminals is not the best approach to take. Firstly, because there is an increased risk of innocent people being killed, which is never good. And there is also the problem of killing criminals, meaning we cannot understand their motivations and question them if, for example, they had been arrested. On the question of, are there other options beyond armed police? Those saying they should be armed police would disagree with this point. They say guns are essential to dealing with gun crime, and there is no other way of stopping crime involving guns, except for giving police guns. However, those disagreeing argue that armed police are not essential everywhere. Most of the time, criminals don't have guns, so you don't need to give every policeman a gun. Furthermore, tasers and other methods to subdue criminals work more effectively than guns and increase trust with the police. Finally then, on the question of what is the best response. Well, those supporting armed police say giving guns to police allows them to defend themselves from attacks and can stop criminals more effectively. There is no better way to deal with crime than with a gun. However, those disagreeing say that giving police guns misses the most important aspect of crime, the motivation. We cannot understand the motivation of people if we simply give police guns, and we miss often deeper issues causing these crimes to occur, as well as sending the wrong message to people. Overall then, those supporting armed police believe they are an effective way to deal with crime. They believe the negative effects of guns are offset by the benefit of being able to deal with any crime effectively. Those opposing armed police, however, argue that they harm trust in the police and may lead to more problems over time. They claim there are better alternatives than simply giving guns to police. The question of how to approach the issue of armed police is one that will constantly be changing. As Western society moves towards more and more opposition to police shootings, we may yet see increased controls on armed police. Ultimately though, what do you think on this issue? Do you believe the police should or should not be armed? And how do you think guns change the image of a police force? Also, is there anything that I missed, got wrong, or could do better? Let me know any of your thoughts in the comments or on Twitter. As always, the aim of this episode has been not to try and argue for or against one side of the debate, but rather to highlight the different opinions on the topic and provide a comparison between them. Be sure to check back on Monday for another episode. Thank you for listening, and I hope to see you all soon.